Good afternoon and welcome to the 2:15 session of Dawn or Doom 2018. It's Monday afternoon. This is the promise and threat of algorithmic governance. And I'm introducing our speaker, Frank Pasquale. Algorithms increasingly govern our social world and impact our lives in myriad ways, transforming data into scores and rankings that decide who gets credit, jobs, dates, policing, and much more. Law and policy experts publish new articles daily on how the algorithms behind artificial intelligence shape our lives, and a growing community of researchers has developed a field known as fairness, accuracy, and transparency in machine learning. But what does fairness mean in this context? And why are policy experts increasingly worried about unfair judgments and discrimination by AI? Frank Pasquale is an expert on the law of artificial intelligence, algorithms, and machine learning. He is recognized as a leader in the global movement for algorithmic accountability and co-organized one of the leading conferences on this topic in 2016. A professor at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, he is the author of The Black Box Society: The Secret Algorithms That Control Money and Information, a book that has received attention and positive reviews worldwide, including in Science and Nature. The book has already been translated into Chinese, French, Korean, and Serbian. Broadly, Pasquale's research focuses on challenges posed to information law by rapidly changing technology, and he is presently researching a book on automation and the professions. His scholarship and public speaking translate complex law and policy into accessible writing and presentations, and he has advised, among others, the US Department of Health and Human Services, the US House Judiciary and Energy and Commerce Committees, the Senate Banking Committee, the Federal Trade Commission, and Directorates General of the European Commission. Today, he will present a talk entitled The Promise and Threat of Algorithmic Governance. Please take a moment to silence all electronic devices, but feel free to tweet using #DawnOrDoom. An artist from the Ink Factory will be creating visual recaps of the talk from our presenter, and you're welcome to take pictures after and share them on social media. And don't be afraid also to chat with the artist and ask questions when she is finished drawing. Thank you, and please enjoy Frank Pasquale.
Well, thank you so much, Jerry, for that very kind introduction. And it's really an honor to be here at Dawn or Doom. A lot of the speakers here are people that have inspired me for years, and I'm just so happy to be here and to get a chance to meet with folks that are at the cutting edge of technology, and also those who are thinking about what the social implications of that technology is. So I want to start with something from halfway around the world, or really all the way around the world, Centrelink in Australia, and with our Indiana State Department of Health. It's fascinating how the promise of algorithmic governance has influenced agencies around the world. A lot of people running very important programs have said, we are really sick and tired of bureaucracy. We think it's way too easy to manipulate attorneys, caseworkers, others involved, and we want to bring the precision of software code and data to the social services. And so that's come to Australia, it's come to Indiana. Similar programs have been implemented around the US, trying to bring different forms of code and software to government. And what I'll be talking about today are how, at the first half of my talk, we'll talk about how these forms of code and governance are making things more efficient, are often contributing to a fairer and more just allocation of social resources. But in the second half of the talk, I'm going to look a bit at the dark side. And by the end of the talk, I won't necessarily try to engage us in the project of measuring the costs and benefits of the algorithmic versus the non-algorithmic for two reasons. One is that, by and large, we're moving toward an algorithmic age. but we can figure out ways of bringing humans into the loop in very positive ways. And secondly, because I think often it's very hard to think about these things in terms of costs and benefits, but they're really about what type of society we're becoming. And that's what I'll ask you to think about as I go over each of these examples with a focus on the positive at the beginning, and then as we look at the dark side in the middle. So we're focusing on the dawn at the beginning, a bit of doom, and then some reflection on both those themes. So one of the things that we see, for example, with ride sharing is a phenomenon I call functional sovereignty. We usually think about, say, the taxis or rides in an area as being governed by a city council, a mayor, other people that run the municipality. But what we're now seeing is that in certain swathes of social life, certain forms of experience, it's not really the government that is the chief governor of what's going on. It's a company like Uber, right? When Uber sort of is very powerful in a given area, it is kind of the sovereign over ride sharing or how people get cars. And this has worked very positively for many people. I know there's lots of folks that have found that, the old taxi system was just not serving them at all, and that now they can just look in their phone and call up a car. And it's flexible for a lot of workers, too, that might have extra time in their day. They can't quite figure out, they can't quite land a job for, say, the 3 hours at night where they might want to work, but they use this to find the work. And here I have an example of how, computationally, we can get it down to the tenths of a multiple, 2.1 times fare can be calculated as what it takes to, say, bring drivers over to the Jacksonville airport when it's really busy, or something like that. And so this is almost a model of how free markets should work, right? And indeed, the American Federal Trade Commission has elevated Uber as a model of that. But just to foreshadow my doom side, there's also concerns that when markets become too perfect, they tip into monopolization. So we're going to think a little bit about that. When things become too perfect, does it give some entities a bit too much power over a given field? Another, in terms of thinking about data-driven solutions, is in Oxford, in the UK, there's been a program called Greater Change, which wants to provide homeless people with more connections to their community. So the idea is that, rather than giving money to any particular homeless person you might come across, you could scan their barcode and then hear about their life story. They might want to tell you, here's why I became homeless, right? And this, you can even think about this as a way in which the privatization of charity matches up to the bureaucratization of benefits determinations, because people might say, oh, I don't want to just give money to any random person. I want to figure out if there's someone with a meritorious story and back them. And so this has been proposed, and it could become a way in which charity takes advantage of data-intensive Internet of Things platforms, sensor networks, etc. Another example where we have people in need and there's a question as to who is deserving and who is not lies in the realm of international refugee resettlement. So we now, of course, have tons of stories about the caravan or in the North America, Central America, etc. Europe has been addressing the issue of people in North Africa wanting to coming out of very war-torn regions or from Syria. And a lot of times the concern has been expressed, well, how do we know if, say, someone coming from Syria is someone who is seeking a form of asylum or other form of refugee status that is legitimate? And how do we know if perhaps they might be someone who has done too many bad things in the past or is a threat to our society, right? And so what IBM has done is they're trying to develop software that could essentially very rapidly produce risk profiles of individuals. And these risk profiles can boil down to scores, and it was presented, I believe, in Defense One magazine as something akin to a credit score, right? So you can think about just as you have a credit score and you might be penalized for being late a few days, and you might be rewarded for having all your balances, say, less than 25% of the account limit. Similarly, this sort of system might have some information, I don't know exactly where it's coming from, on individuals coming and seeking some sort of refuge. And so that is, again, an effort to shift things that have traditionally been done in a legal or at least quasi-juridical way toward big data, software, et cetera. And this background in credit scores is fascinating because if you think about how credit scoring has been done, part of my Black Box Society book is about the history of how we moved from credit histories to more formally structured reports to finally scores. And as that moved along, what was promised was the idea of precision and of objective criteria assessing everyone, right? You wouldn't have some random person at a bank who would say, look at you and maybe judge you in a random way or a capricious way. The promise was that the score would be something that would be applied to everyone equally. But then there were always, even as this was being done, worries because the scores were not disclosed. They were trade secrets, right? There's a company called Fair Isaac Corporation. Other of the bigger credit bureaus don't disclose these scoring systems. And so what we were promised was, in a way, a trade-off. It was secrecy in scoring that was promised to be objective by nature because it was mathematical. And part of what I'm going to try to help us interrogate today or think through is that a bargain we should accept in other areas, such as this refugee terrorist determination or other forms of determination? The country that is the most advanced in terms of promoting these scoring systems is China. So under the social credit scoring system of China, the idea of the credit score can go far beyond your past history of paying bills or not paying bills, okay? As you can see from this graphic from the Wall Street Journal, it could include things like your academic honesty. Were you ever accused or convicted of plagiarism in college or high school? Utility bills. Volunteer activity could be on the positive side. Filial piety as well, so any of the parents in the audience that don't feel you're visited enough, you know, that could be a big penalty for your kids in the future if they don't. Shopping habits. We just had an article in Vox the other day that said, buy too many video games, that seems like an unreliable, untrustworthy person. Buy diapers, that is the hallmark of the reliable parent, right, who fits into the biopolitical frame of the current administration in China. And the idea there is that we could also use these scores to expand the capacity of the state to regulate. So one thing that I was recently at a conference in Hong Kong, listening to some Hong Kong and other Chinese scholars talking about the use of the score in environmental regulation. And the way this would work is that, say you have someone who owns a small company and they dump pollution in the water, and a court judgment is issued against them, but there's corruption, there are other ways in which people can, buy their way out of the judgment or avoid detection. So the judgment may never be paid. But with the social credit score system, the idea is that there would be a ripple effect from that judgment through every aspect of that polluter's life. So that the polluter, say it's an executive of a company, may find years later they can't buy certain train tickets, or that their child doesn't get into a certain college, or that there are other sort of ripple effects that were not sort of noticed, that he wouldn't necessarily know about at the time of the judgment, but that had been algorithmically sorted into the allocation mechanisms of different agencies of the government, right? And so this is presented, the promise as it's presented of this system, is one of multiplying state capacity without taxes, right? Without high levels of taxes, because you don't have to worry about buying a whole army of bureaucrats to go after polluters. All you have to do is make sure that a scoring system is sufficiently robust that they will bear the weight and the brunt of punishment in all sorts of aspects of their lives. And one of the slogans of the social credit scoring system is that the trustworthy person will be able to travel around the world, whereas the untrustworthy will not be able to take a single step, right? That's an official government slogan of the system. So this is a rather dramatic example of how algorithmic scoring systems could not merely supplement, but even step in for our traditional notions of government. And what I would propose is that even if you're really skeptical of the ways in which bureaucracies operate, that at least we do have traditions of administrative law, a topic that I teach, of due process, of notice, of an ability to contest, of appeals, and that it's worrisome if we stand on the cusp of losing those. The reason I think it's worrisome is because when you look at the ways in which a lot of these algorithmic systems operate, they're a black box. And I use the black box, both in the engineering sense of something where information goes in, it's transformed in some way, and an output comes out, but we don't understand the exact nature in which it was transformed. But also in the sense of, there are black boxes in planes that we excavate when in the awful event of a plane crash, where they keep track of literally thousands of variables. And when you combine the ability for algorithmic governance with the ability of sensors and other networks to keep track of literally thousands of variables on each one of us, that leads to a really intimidating capacity for these black box systems to exercise lots of influence on our daily lives via all of these different lists of whitelists, blacklists, threat scores, risk scores, insurability. All of these are things that people are being assessed on right now. And I just found a really interesting thing in my Twitter feed, or I just tweeted out on @FrankPasquale a story from the Financial Times today that talked about the documentation of new algorithms in the workplace, alerting bosses to workers who may be about to commit fraud, who may be looking for another job, who may otherwise be a risk to the company. But none of them are notified of this. And so what we have to think about is, can we impose some new forms of accountability and notice at least in these systems as they start to dominate the judicial system, the workplace, credit, insurance, employability, tenancies, other areas like that. Boiling down the concerns that I've just outlined today, and you can see, I guess, from this little box that algorithms are easily malfunction. That's one from this little typo on the slide. But the data used in these systems may be inaccurate or inappropriate. That's our first concern, right? That even if we were to accept the legitimacy of something like the social credit scoring system, what happens if somebody gets false data in the system? And by the way, there are already anecdotal reports of that happening in China. There's been reports that essentially banks will take the files of their best customers and they will send in discrediting information to the central system. And the reason they would do that is because that makes sure that their best customers can't get better deals at other banks, right? If you were a bank that was really mercenary, you would do that, and especially if you knew that there was no system for scrutinizing what's going on, like the Fair Credit Reporting Act in the United States. We, thanks to laws from 1970, get to actually look at our credit report, but in other countries they don't. And so that's a real worry that the system, without systems of review, creates the incentive for inaccurate or inappropriate data. The other is that the algorithmic modeling may be biased or limited, right? So algorithmic modeling, as we saw during the financial crisis, a lot of the models that were predicting whether a mortgage-backed security was good or not were based on data for 50 years during which never did we see all the housing prices in the country suddenly all go down together, right? But then something new happened. In fact, the new thing happened in part because it was enabled by the models that said it was very unlikely to happen. That's part of the paradoxes of finance, right? The people bet on these very unlikely occurrences and then through a certain series of bets can actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so that's another problem with algorithmic modeling. And third, the use of algorithms is still opaque in many critical sectors. Now, we have lots of places where we don't understand what's going into these algorithms, even when they are used by government. And that's something I find particularly troubling, right? Because we all are committed to a principle of freedom of information. We need to know what's going on to make government accountable. But a lot of times what government decision makers can do is they can sign contracts with private entities that say, we will keep your trade secrets, we'll never reveal them. And then those contracts effectively keep the algorithm that is, say, determining benefits or determining other really important aspects of a person's lives from ever being disclosed to the press, to the public, et cetera. And that's something we really have to work on. Fortunately, New York City actually has an algorithmic accountability task force that's trying to deal with this, but it's very hard. It's a hard problem, and we'll get into why it's hard in a little bit. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the dark side, and this is a cartoon from Australia about something called Robodebt. Okay, so I earlier mentioned this thing called Centrelink, and that was the Australian bureaucracy that was going after people, and it was taking away certain amounts of the benefits that they were due if it had determined that they had been overpaid at a given time. But unfortunately, the way that the coders programmed the relevant law was to extrapolate any week-long or month-long stretch of income to a yearly income, right? So if you had a good week in 1 week, they could extrapolate that you were going to have 51 more good weeks. And the problem was, of course, that a lot of people who were in the situation of needing certain benefits had very precarious lives. Sometimes they'd get a job, sometimes they wouldn't. They were on sort of the gig economy. And because of that, they would have a lot of these debts collection notices sent to them automatically, almost robotically, right? And they would have to substantiate, what they actually had earned at a given time. But as we all know, it can be hard to prove a negative. So you have lots of people that are sort of caught up in this bureaucratic system because it was prematurely automated. It's what my friend Brian Shepard at Seton Hall University calls premature disruption. A lot of us probably have heard of Clayton Christensen's theory of disruption, and it certainly is influential in the business world. But we have to worry about premature disruption when we don't have proper procedures for appeal or for other forms of redetermination when there's mistakes by automated systems. Another example, and I earlier had mentioned the Indiana Department of Health, which has implemented many very interesting and cutting-edge forms of automation, but there are also negative stories. So in a recent book called Automating Inequality, there's a whole chapter on problems that have happened at Indiana, including the story of Omega Young, who got a letter prompting her to recertify for Medicaid. There were lots of caseworkers that were fired because the idea was, well, software can do the work of the people here. Well, it turned out she had ovarian cancer. She was having a tough time. She was in the hospital. She said, I really am having a difficult time trying to meet the legal case here to try to recertify what I should be getting in terms of benefits and help. And ultimately, she was given an automated reason to that she was not going to get the benefits anymore. She ultimately won the appeal, but the day after she died. And so what we have to think about here, I think, is how do we, and this whole story and many stories like it is described in this brilliant book called Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks. And part of the story here is, do we make automated systems robust enough with durable backups and humans in the loop so that we can avoid more stories like Omega Young's? And this is not just an Indiana problem. There's a story of a child named Deontay Diver in Maryland, where I'm from. There's lots of stories here of these systems not living up to our values, I think, in terms of the due process afforded by them. Also, when you look even inside Uber's black box, there are concerns by drivers, right? A lot of drivers can do very well if they get, say, certain levels of scores, but there's always a problem of, say, the mean-spirited passenger who just gives a bad score for no reason, or the fat finger error. I mean, this happened to me. I recently was in an Uber and I tried to give someone a higher tip than they suggested, but I was clumsy. I hit done instead of like $4, and then it went to forward and there was no tip given. And I tried for a half hour to figure out how to rectify it, and I got caught in like this tree of things where I had to try to talk to different departments, et cetera. But there were no people. There was no person I could talk to and say, look, I really want to give that driver a larger tip than you suggested. And so this is a problem that happens to many of the drivers. And in New York, fortunately, there's actually something called a driver's guild, where they can appeal certain forms of certain judgments against them or certain scores against them. And I think that's going to be part of the future of algorithmic accountability, is more opportunities to get at least some say, to say, hey, why'd that happen to me? Because in a world where, if you drop below the 4.8, or you could lose your ability, or the 4.7, you could lose your ability to drive, that is something where I think we need a little bit more of a human touch. Another is in terms of scanning the homeless. I earlier mentioned the scanning the homeless issue. The idea there was that there's a group of people in society that maybe we need to scrutinize a bit more before they are given more social resources. But as I've written in a chapter for this book called Big Data, Crime, and Social Control, if we're going to do that with respect to people at the bottom of the income scale, we may also need to do that with respect to some folks at the top, particularly looking at the history of financial crises. So part of, I think, social justice in the future is trying to ensure that as we develop systems of surveillance, that they are equitably distributed, right? There are benefits that are going to come to many people, but there are also burdens, and there is some duty to think about how to spread those burdens equitably. Also, I think that the big data blacklisting in the US bodes ill for that IBM score for refugee/terrorist scoring, right? And the reason I think that is because if you look at the history in the US of the no-fly list, the no-work list, and the no-voting list, there's a lot of critiques of those lists. There was a lot of problem with the ways that they were administered. And this particularly was chronicled by Margaret Hu in her article, Big Data Blacklisting. And I think that, before we set up more systems that are based on big data or based on non-narrative ways of assessing people's merit or threat, that we have to think further about how to build in safeguards to those systems and how to make them humanly explicable. And this is an area where I have a lot of disagreements with folks in artificial intelligence, because There are people in AI who say the whole nature of AI is that we're going to be making determinations that we can't explain to any human. There's a roboticist at Columbia who once said, trying to explain how my machine makes decisions, trying to explain that to humans is like trying to explain Shakespeare to a dog. Okay? And I think that we could accept that. We could say, well, the people behind the computers have found this way of governing and way of sorting and ranking people that is beyond human understanding, to evoke a theological idea. But I would rather that we try to shape the way that they develop these systems toward what's called explainable AI, toward a way of doing artificial intelligence that can be broken into causal, even narrative forms of explanation. And there's a guy named Judea Pearl, who's a brilliant machine learning expert that's been pursuing that line of work for 20, 30 years. And I would say that if you look at the big tech companies, Google has expressed a lot of interest in it. I see a lot less interest in some other companies in the explainable AI. And that's going to be a big divide. And I think there's a role for the public to try to push AI toward being explainable, toward being systems that we can understand. Also, I think in terms of this type of data-driven society, we have to be careful as we bring more data in. So there's a report by Harlan Yu and David Robinson called Knowing the Score that looks at the way in which credit data has been expanded over time. So we start with baseline data, and that's your traditional scoring mechanism. We can move to alternative data that are things like utility payments, other payment data. But there are now systems that even use what are called fringe alternative data, like how do you use social media? And this could be something as simple as, do you use a lot of all caps and exclamation points on Twitter, right? And I might even agree that the person that does that should be denied credit, But having borne the brunt of these replies for years. But I also think that there are ways in which your metadata is used to judge you. For example, are you a person that's like tweeting at 1 or 2 a.m. or something like that? That could be seen as discrediting. Other things could be seen as discrediting, as indicative of the nighttime media use could be seen as indicative of, could be explained post hoc as indicative of mental illness, apparently according to some of these entities. And as I testified before the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee last year, I think it's really important that before we use these types of data trails, data exhaust trails to judge people, that we also try to ensure that they're not, say, systematically discriminatory and that we're not creating these self-fulfilling prophecies, right? Because particularly in the area of credit, if you discredit someone and give them a low credit score based on this fringe data, you are sort of creating a situation where they're only going to get loans that are, say, at 10, 12, 15% interest, which are harder to pay back. So you create the conditions that are likely to verify or validate your model. And that's the way in which a lot of these social forms of science, social sciences, are not like natural science, right? Whatever an engineer says about the bridge, that's not going to cause the bridge to collapse, right? But if certain people that are taking these forms of score engineering to finance say negative things about certain people, they are indeed making it more likely that those people are going to have a tough time in the future when they predict it. And that's something we have to think very deeply about, this discontinuity between natural and social science. And one humorous example of this was written up by Susie Cagle. She's an artist, activist, and she imagines a future where if you add social and peer-based credit scoring, where people's scores are based on the scores of what their friends have, that you could see a future where people end up dropping friends with low scores to make sure their scores are higher, right? And that is the subject of a patent that is presently held by Facebook. They have not actually implemented the patent. It also, according to some people, is part of the Chinese outline for a social credit scoring system 2014 to 2020. But I have not independently verified that, and there is controversy over it. But the idea is quite worrisome, right? The idea is quite worrisome of there being this possibility of a downward spiral to the extent your score could be determined by other people's scores, the scores of people you know. And my worry is that this could move from social credit to what I would call eusocial credit, right? The eusocial animals like bees, other forms of animal life, there's such regimentation there. And I see those things happening both in the US and around the world, where there could be such regimentation caused by a scoring system that goes a little too far, right? A scoring system that made your score based on what your friend's score is, or a scoring system that tried to make your score based on, say, what your political views were. Each of those would be very troubling, right? Because we don't want to live in a world where our credit could be determined by whether the banks agree with who we support politically or not. So what's next? I think there's some really good ideas coming out of Europe. This is Margareta Vestager, who's the head of the Competition Bureau there. And she's proposed a lot of things with respect to both privacy and competition law. What I really like about the European approach is that they see privacy and competition together. In the US, a lot of times these things are siloed, like you're either an antitrust expert or you're a privacy expert, and the two sides don't talk to each other that much. That's starting to change. I'm actually doing testimony before the Federal Trade Commission this Wednesday to try to also bridge that gap. But I think that this is going to be something we're going to see more and more of in the future, how we think about what does privacy policy need to look like when data gets concentrated in a small number of firms. A second is there's something called the Freedom from Facebook campaign, which says you could split up Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram, right? These are all part of the same company right now. The idea there is that to the extent that you have different scoring systems, different ways of assessing people, different ways of presenting them with information, remember all these scores are being used not just to assess you for advertisers, but then potentially for advertisers to look to what should appear in your feed and all these different areas. That if you split that up, at least you watered down the degree of power that was held by any one private entity, right? Ultimately, all of this is going to require fairness in due process and algorithmic governance. I think that lawyers have learned a lot from technologists over the past 2 decades, and it's time to rebalance some of those technical systems with ideals of fairness and due process and empathy. And I'll give you one last example of where this might lead and some of the trouble that could occur if we don't try to add some values of due process and fairness and empathy to algorithmic governance. Within the realm of dating, there is a lot of corporate experimentation. Right? There's a lot of experimentation in dating and social networks, like Facebook got in trouble for rejiggering the feed to try to make people either happy or sad, to experiment with whether if you changed people's feed a bit, they would end up being posting more happy words or more sadder words, and that was used as a proxy for them being happy or sad. OkCupid also talked about its experimentation, and in particular, there was something that became controversial because what they did was they decided for a certain group of people that they would reverse their algorithm. So they would tell people who normally would never be matched that they were really good matches, and that they would tell people that were good matches that actually they were very bad matches. And they would just sort of see what would happen, right? And the company was extremely flippant about this. They said, yeah, we experiment on human beings, what do you think? Oh, what's of it? And what I worry about is that if we keep notions of fairness and human dignity outside of these technical processes, it's way too easy for this to become the default mode of self-understanding of people that are in charge of massive amounts of data, millions of dating profiles, millions of other profiles, et cetera. A similar version of this was that Ashley Madison was in trouble for having fake fembots. They had all these fake profiles on the site. And we don't want to live in a Truman Show, right? And a lot of people say, well, that's because technology is so far ahead of law and law can never keep up. But it's not true. It's not true. I mean, the ideas that I just brought up are very ancient legal principles going back at least to Runnymede and the Magna Carta. And even within my state, Maryland, after OkCupid did this, 2 of my colleagues wrote a letter to the Attorney General of Maryland saying that actually Facebook and OkCupid have essentially done things that raise quite a significant possibility of breaking the law of Maryland with respect to the ways in which people have to be notified when they are the subject to human subject experimentation done upon them, right? And this, unfortunately, was never pursued by the state. But I think what it shows is that there are some ideals of tempering algorithmic governance with humane values that we really have to be able to follow up on. So my parting thoughts here are, the Black Box Society, this is the Chinese English version, and it's out there. I'm trying to spread the word about some of its ideas. But what I talked about today was primarily based on a more recent paper called A Rule of Persons, Not Machines. And I hope that if you're interested in it, you might take a look at that paper. I've got other stuff. I'm happy to be in touch. And think about how this might affect engineering practices, ethics for engineers, ethics in the humanities, and how humanities and philosophy can enter into more technical systems. And I'm hoping that this work can reach a broader audience, because I think ultimately the way we solve these problems is not just bring in the lawyers, but it's bringing in social scientists, computer scientists, journalists, attorneys, other experts, to work together cooperatively to figure out how do we get the best of the technology while still maintaining the best of our humanity. So, thank you. So,
if there are questions that people would like to ask Frank, please would you come to one of these mics here on here. We're recording this event and this will enable the questions to be heard. And we'll do this until about 10 after 3. All right, thank you very much.
So I'm just curious. Did you hand the cab driver $4 in cash?
no, it was too late. It was too late because you have to rate the trip after you get out. So yeah, I felt like I've really done this guy an injustice. And then I don't know. I mean, if you're out there, please, if he's watching this on YouTube, you know where to find me. So yes, sorry.
I have a question here.
Oh, yeah.
I was intrigued by the fact that people felt, when Cupid, inverted the logic of their algorithms, I was intrigued that the people felt like being experimented upon only then. I think they were experimented upon all the time.
That is a really powerful point. And clearly, the way they would be defended, I think, by the dominant mode of business would be to say that this is A/B testing. We do A/B testing all the time, and this is just an A/B test of a particularly unlikely to succeed algorithm. I think, though, that perhaps one of the ways we could get out from under that particular formalism, I think it's a very formalistic mode of reasoning about it, would be to say that when you use these systems, you assume that they have something of your best interests at heart, right? Now, should you assume that? Maybe not. But on the other hand, what we did with respect to doctors and lawyers over centuries is, when people went to a doctor, they really don't understand the nature of the medical science, right? If I go to a doctor, I don't have a medical degree. I really don't understand it. And so because of that, the doctor is held to a higher standard than, say, somebody who's just trying to sell me, say they're trying to sell me a computer at the store, right? The doctor is held to what's called a fiduciary standard. And they actually have to think about my well-being while they're advising me. They can't and it's quite a strict fiduciary standard, right? They can't say, well, there's 2 equally good drugs, but one would make me more money, so I'm gonna prescribe that one, right? They'd have to disclose that to me. They'd have to be somewhat open about that. And I think that one of the challenges for the future, and this is in the work of Ian Kerr from 20 years ago and now being revived by other scholars, is that we should think about what would a fiduciary standard look like with respect to some of these companies. I don't think that if OkCupid were acting as a fiduciary, it could have done that, right? I think that they should have, they could say, we're gonna tweak it and we're gonna see that maybe there's people that we wouldn't usually put at the top of your feed or your choices. I don't know exactly how it gets arranged, but but we're gonna slightly tweak that to say, try a different form of exposure. But I don't think they could be like, oh, let's just spin it completely around and see what'll happen. Over here? Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate the social credit score. I hadn't seen that. It's both fascinating and terrifying at the same time, exactly what Don and Doom is. My question is, thinking about the Capitol Hill conversations about, is Facebook a tech company or a media company? It seems as though people are trying to put them in a box that they already know. Is it time to start treating all these companies as big data companies and have a new set of laws for that?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. And I think that I remember writing this blog post back in 2008 called Is Google a phone book, a media company, a cable network, et cetera? And the problem is that in law, because of systems of precedent, we are compelled to try to draw really imperfect analogies. So for example, when we think about regulation of Google, for example, I wrote an article called Platform Neutrality that said there should be must-carry rules for certain sites, that Google couldn't knock out sites just out of its own commercial interest. I said that is possible because under a 1994 Supreme Court ruling called Turner versus FCC, the Supreme Court said that the Federal Communications Commission could force cable networks to add certain channels to the network. The opposite precedent is a case called Tornillo from 1968, where the state of Florida had said, if you own a newspaper in Florida and you harshly criticize a political candidate, you have to give equal time. The Supreme Court said, absolutely not, that violates their free speech rights. And so the way it's set up is is Google more like a cable network like Comcast providing you with a set of channels? Or is it more like the newspaper, the Miami Herald, and Miami Herald versus Tornillo? And what you're suggesting is, again, I think where Europe is going, because they're going toward like these e-privacy directives, the general data protection regulation, that seek transcendent legal categories that go beyond the sense that this is just media law or this is just communications law, et cetera. Because part of what I find is that when you get media law people looking at Google, they often, or Facebook or these other big tech firms, they often come in with this real bias towards saying, oh, well, we have to really be hands-off because they're expressing things. But then when you get people who are saying privacy law, they're saying, well, they're a big database and we regulate what's in a database all the time. And so trying to bring all those together, and that's been what I've been trying to do in my work, is try to bring all these different legal perspectives together, because ultimately we need to do that, and perhaps ultimately there's going to be a new set of rules. By the way, the most concrete version of that is probably Senator John Warner's 20 policy proposals for social media. And I encourage Googling that, because they're very good policy proposals that are also very fair-minded on both sides. So, thanks. Over here? Yeah.
Yeah. In regards to the social credit from China, I saw on YouTube a 30-minute video the other day, and it was footnoted as ABC Australia, which I don't quite understand because I didn't realize ABC had a presence in Australia. But if you're looking in YouTube, that's where you can find it. It was all about the social credit and the, something like 200 million cameras that are all going into a database and being artificially intelligently analyzed, who you spend time with, who you walk into the store with, what you put in your shopping cart, what's going on Facebook. And of course, everyone being interviewed as a Chinese citizen is like, oh yes, of course, we love this system because, God forbid they should say something against the government. My big concern with this is, yeah, it's got tremendous value, but what if one is doing ethical things in one's own life that disagree with the values of the state? You're in deep, deep trouble. And that's why I think this social credit is terrifying. It's Orwellian.
Well, I agree with you. No, I mean, I think that it is a deep, deep problem. And I watched that same series, and part of what I thought was very troubling about it was that they had someone who basically said, I love this system because, and between the lines, you could read her rationale was, because I'm probably going to end up on top of it, right? I'm probably going to, and any scoring system like that, and this is where I've done a lot of work on sort of the sociology of scoring. It's a fascinating area. Any system like that does create winners and losers, right? And if you can get enough buy-in from the people who are winners, who think they're going to be winners, versus the losers. So imagine if like 50% of the people will be winners, maybe another 20% think they're going to be winners, and then there's only 30% against it. Well, then even in a democracy, it could get adopted. And it's funny because even there are elements of the Affordable Care Act and something called MACRA that do this to doctors. There's something called the Medicare Incentive Payment System that basically says to doctors, if you do these certain things that we want you to do, you can get a bonus, but the way we pay that bonus is that we take money from the people that don't do enough of the things, right? And so these scoring systems can be very troubling in terms of their disciplinary impact. And I think that ultimately, with respect to the social credit scoring, I hope that, I just hope it's not adopted outside of China. It seems like it's really captured the imagination of a lot of officials there. And I think you're exactly right to say that it is a way of ensuring top-down control via collaboration on the most granular level, right? And I even have heard a story of someone who was teaching at a Chinese university, and she wanted to see a church service. She had friends that had a church there, and she went to the service. And then one of her colleagues at the university informed on her to the dean, and then the dean said, well, you're going to be, your pay is going to be docked by half for 3 months, and if we see you doing that again, you're fired, right? And that to me is sort of a situation where if you can put that into algorithms where people wouldn't even know, but would just live in terror of the possibility, not merely of doing something wrong, but of possibly being stigmatized for looking like they were doing something wrong, then it is a system of quite perfected social control that we really have to consider as a potential human rights violation. I tried to write up something about the nature of collective punishment, whereby if someone has a low score and all their friends are scored low as well, I thought of that as a collective punishment, but it's hard to write up under human rights law. But it seems like, to get back to the point about law adapting, we need to have conceptions of human rights that can lead us to conclusions that I think would reject the application of something that is that granular and that oppressive. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Hi. Hi. I'm a student from China, and I know the social credit system works in China. I personally like the idea that because I think it is important to build the trust among the people. But after I see the government collect tremendous amount of data from the Chinese social media and the Alibaba, which is an online shopping website, I'm kind of afraid that the government have too much power or too much information know the people's personal life. And as you know, the Chinese government is not fully democratic. For example, if I make some negative comments on internet to criticize the government, they may lower my social credit score, which may affect me traveling or whatsoever. Yeah. So do you think that will give the government more power to manage or even control the society?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. And I think that you are absolutely right in your sense that, you know, knowledge is power. And I think this is part of what it's hard coming out of like a intellectual tradition of enlightenment to say, like our usual sense is that the more we know, the better that is, right? Yeah. But then the question becomes, that does run up against concerns about privacy. And my worry is that exactly what you're saying, that there should be a way in which our household life and aspects of our life can't be known, at least by certain powerful individuals. And there's a good book, actually, and I should say, I don't want to just be seen as harping on China here. I think that many governments around the world are excessively surveilling their citizens, and that's being enabled by companies whose business model is predicated on marketing, right? So there's this connection that is really troubling. And the question then becomes, how do you set certain limits on the knowable? How do you do things like minimize the data? How do you ensure that, say, people are not having one misstep affect their whole lives? Each of those, I think, would be ways of trying to curb the power of any particular government or corporation to use that data against people. And the last example I'll give, and this very provocative idea called Paul Ohm, is that the more data an entity accumulates, the more it has what he calls a database of ruin. Okay? That you have this database that is essentially, it might have one thing that's discrediting about a person, and it makes them vulnerable. So yeah, those are very important concerns. And I don't know exactly what the answer is, though, within certain systems, because, but I think that at least within democracies and other places, there are ways of pushing back and maybe pushing a legal order. And ultimately, I do think that the courts may be the best way to push back against it, to sort of that judicial institutions may be able to push back a bit. But thanks.
Yeah. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
So you said about the judicial system. Do you think in the future the robots or artificial intelligence will replace judges? And for example, another example is, you know, the Asian community in America, like suing Harvard University for college admissions. They think they've been targeting Asian students for unfair college admission. Do you think, and in rural parts of China, there is like, you can bribe the judge to get away with like crimes. Do you think in the future the artificial intelligence can get involved in judicial system to bring fairness?
That, I will. The question was whether given current biases and problems in judicial systems in the United States and in China, whether administrators might choose to replace human judges with artificial intelligence. And this article, The Rule of Persons, Not Machines, I canvass at the beginning of the article, I talk about the leading thinkers who think that will happen. And I mean, there are lesser versions of it, like a book called Law as Engineering, and then there are other versions that talk about a legal singularity, where you'd essentially just be able to have all the data possible and make decisions just on the basis of that data. I don't think that's going to happen, though, because I think that to be legitimate, the system has to be operated by individuals who can think in terms and offer reasons to the individuals that they're judging. And this is what Keel Brennan Marquez calls the reciprocity condition. He says that the only way it's legitimate for a judge to tell someone they're going to 10 years in prison is to be the type of entity that could understand 10 years in prison as a very serious punishment, whereas a robot couldn't really understand the gravity of it. Now, I know that is probably not a satisfying answer, but I will also say that there's so many problems of implementation that this article also gets into, but it's a great question. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Pasquale. In terms of your specialty in law school, how many law schools are trying to incentivize more and more faculty to take up that specialty?
Oh, of law and technology?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's very interesting. There are places that we have a law and technology course at Maryland. There's a lot of places that are trying to build that. Probably Northwestern is doing a really notable job of bringing the engineering and the law departments together. And I was part of something called the Council on Big Data Ethics and Society that was trying to think about how you bring sort of law and policy people to the technical side and how you bring the technical side to the law and policy people. It is sometimes a little bit difficult, though, because it is, you have to get a basic understanding of coding to understand some of the applications. Georgetown now has a class in law and coding, and I think a few other law schools do as well. And I predict, yeah, within 10, 20 years, that'll be a course everywhere, right? Everybody will have something that will think about, because it's a useful way to think about how law operates and how it's different than, and similar to engineering systems, right? And in tax is probably where you see the closest convergence. And there was a recent article by Sarah Losky, who's at Northwestern, on how she believes that fairness in the tax code might be achieved by writing it out in sort of logical notation or pseudocode. And that is, to me, really interesting. You know, when you think about how many people use TurboTax and how many ways in which we've effectively boiled down the tax code to software that just takes inputs and puts out outputs. But the worry I have about that sort of transition is something that's offered by Lawrence Zelenak, and he's written an article saying that because TurboTax can do people's taxes, the government and Congress in particular keep making the tax code more complex because they say, well, people don't need to understand it, they just feed it into TurboTax. And so the worry then becomes, you know, if you really believed in, say, a tax code that you could write on a piece of paper or a postcard, that sort of knocks out a lot of the engineering work there, you know, or the software coding work. So it's really going to be interesting to think about how the affordances that the technology give us can make the law perhaps more granular, more fair, but could also make it so complex that people don't understand it. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, it's actually interesting because I think you just answered part of my question, but I wanted to also talk about the solution to the issues you've been talking about, specifically with explainable AI with the public. Mm-hmm. So in what ways do you think with like the growing complexity of programs and AI, can you explain these complex issues to a public who doesn't have that coding background that maybe these engineers or possibly even law professors are now starting to have?
Mm-hmm. So I think that one of the things that I get into is, even if, let's say, you had certain machine learning approaches that really we do not understand how the different transformations are being made, and I know there was a guy from Cisco, or someone from Cisco earlier, who was showing how the self-driving car sees the road, and it's very different from how we see the road, right? That is complicated, but I think that there are some ways in which, you know, you could try to ensure that the system is fair. So for example, you could say, we limit the inputs to the system, right? If, let's say that we had a system that used hundreds of variables to assess how good of an employee a person is. We might say to a person, yeah, you could use hundreds of variables, but you can't use that person's medical records, right? Or you can't use, once they go home, you can't keep watching them, right? There was a hedge fund in Europe, actually, that was trying to correlate how long its traders slept and what they ate with their trading performance. Okay? And so we might say to people, at least we're going to keep that data in. But your question, I know, is something that's more about, let's say it makes a decision based on hundreds of variables that says, this person, even though they weren't too good this year, they're going to be great next year, but we can't tell you why. That I worry about. And that I think that ultimately it may be that these sorts of systems have, may need to be limited in certain aspects where we perhaps say the hiring the decision, but they may end up really informing decisions later on. But I still think that I would encourage as best practice management to think further about how it would make its decisions understandable, because I think they're going to face real morale issues if people just say, well, my future is determined by a black box and there's really very little I can do to change it. But yeah, I think thinking further about how to deal with that is going to be a major challenge, and I appreciate the question. Thanks.
So I'd like to thank Frank Pasquale for actually a fabulous presentation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.